Hey everyone! For today's video, we're going to be doing something a little bit different. Sorry for the lack of uploads lately, but I've been busy preparing for a tournament, namely the tournament I'm going to be sharing with you here today. So over the weekend on the 25th and 26th of January, I played in the Australia Day Weekender 2025.
SWB audio
Time controls for
captured,
this tournament
not
were 60
registered.
minutes with a 30-second increment per side, and there were a lot of strong players here, including four candidate masters, one FIDE master, and even one international master. And not to mention, a lot of players were above the ratings of 1900 and 2000, aside from the title players I just mentioned. So I did end up finishing second in this tournament, which not only makes this my first ever classical tournament, but also my best ever classical tournament. So in the first round, I got paired up against Harsha Shedigar, who was rated 1540 FIDE. Obviously, nothing to be scoffed at, and I am obviously an unrated player, this being my first tournament and all. So let's just dive into it. First game, our opponent plays d4, knight to f6, knight to f3, g6. And here I expected my opponent to play bishop to f4. I'll just play it out. Bishop to f4, which would be a London system. And I do have London system lines in my prep. I might share them at some point. But instead, my opponent plays bishop to g5, which I wasn't too concerned about, even though I didn't have any lines prepared specifically against it, just because I figured we would probably result in very similar pawn structures. And as long as I followed the four main principles of opening play, I didn't think I could be in too much trouble. The four principles, namely, are developing your pieces towards the center to active positions, using your pawns to lay some claim over the center, passing your king, and connecting your rooks finally. So I wasn't too concerned, and I figured that I could use a lot of the same ideas, which is exactly how it played out. So my opponent played e3 here, but I just want to take a moment to stop and mention that the main move in this line, this is obviously in retrospect, not having been familiar with the line at the time of the game, is knight b to d2, after which say castles c3, d6, and e4 is pretty standard.
SWB audio captured,
And the point
not
of this
registered.
is white has this big pawn center, and black has we call this hypermodernism. Hypermodernism. Black has a setup which allows white to overextend in the center, and we choose to attack it when the time is right. But all this is a moot point because our opponent plays, sorry, our opponent plays e3. And there's nothing wrong with this move. In fact, this has been played by incredibly strong players. Namely, I think Paul Curies, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, has played this on occasion. And Paul Curies is a 2600, so obviously he must know what he's doing. So anyway, I played d6, h3, castles, and I did have prep with the bishop on f4. I figured I could probably borrow a lot of the same ideas, and in keeping in that fashion, I play c5. Oh, sorry. Our opponent plays bishop to c4 here. Not the main move, but also there's nothing inherently wrong about it. I guess you lose the optionality of pushing the pawn over to c4 at some point in time, which might be an option in a lot of lines that could be useful, but bishop to c4 still perfectly playable. I play c5 with the thinking that if d takes c5, I might be able to play knight to e4, unleashing the bishop along this long diagonal, and after white defends, I'll probably be able to take and win the bishop pair. Oh, sorry, not takes back. Yeah, engine just corrected me. Taking here would be obviously a big mistake because queen takes, rook takes, and this pawn is hanging at the end. So thank you, Stockfish. But our opponent chooses not to take, which I think is the correct choice. Instead, he plays c3, building this very strong pawn center, this strong triangle, which is very
SWB
common
audio
in these
captured,
kinds of
not
openings for white,
registered.
these kinds of setups. So I play a6 with the intention of playing b5 and just generally getting some space on the queen side whilst getting a tempo on the bishop as well. Another reason why the bishop maybe doesn't feel so comfortable on c4. In fact, we'll see in the game that I did manage to win a few tempi against the bishop just because of its awkward positioning. So I play a6. Our opponent, seeing our threat, plays a4. Obviously, right now, taking is not possible. because the rook would be hanging. So after a4, I realized that white's setup doesn't particularly lay claim over the light squares in the center, and I thought that it would be useful to try and take control over those squares. So I played d5. It might seem a bit weird pushing the same pawn twice in the opening, but I feel like it's justified because of the tempo that we win against the bishop. Our opponent plays bishop to d3, and here I saw a line which, after queen to b6, if our opponent had played queen to c2, I could just simply play c4. The bishop has to move back, and after bishop to f5, getting a tempo against the queen has to go back to c1, and just taking stock of this position, white has immense control over the light squares in white's camp. And it's not so clear how white unravels from this position. So instead, our opponent plays rook to a2, which I thought was a bit of an odd move, and the engine doesn't like it so much, but there is an idea behind it, which we will see in the game. So I play rook to e8, generally just putting the rook on an active square and potentially in some lines preparing e5 as well to undermine and strike back against
SWV
white's
audio
solid pawn
capture
structures.
not registered.
So our opponent plays d takes c5, queen takes obviously, and here's the point of rook to a2. Rook to a2 can prove to be useful because the rook can easily swing along the second rank and potentially apply pressure on the d file. So I drop my queen back and bishop to f5 here. Sorry, bishop to f4. Down here, I have a couple of options. One would be to move the queen back, say to d8, after which I think white has a pretty good control over the position. Black is obviously not worse here. In fact, the engine thinks that black is a little bit better. But I didn't really like the control that white has over a lot of squares in the center. And I thought that with e5, which I did play, I could bait my opponent into taking. So let's just go through what happens if white takes, which he did. After bishop takes, rook takes, knight takes, queen takes. And here I just want to pause. Taking stock of the position, we have an imbalance in which white has a rook and a pawn in exchange for a bishop and a knight. And this is a very common imbalance in chess. And generally, I think the knight and bishop combination or two minor piece combination trumps the rook and the pawn in the opening and middle game when activity is more paramount. In the end game, the rook and pawn obviously have a bit more have a bit more weight because of the potential of the pawn queening and also the checkmate opportunities that rook and pawn have. So queen to e2, knight to e4. I saw that it would be easy to apply pressure on c3. This applies
SWV
pressure in
audio
not only
capture
one,
not
two, but
registered.
also three ways. And it's not so clear how white defends it. So he takes the knight, I take back, and the rook swings over to d2. And here, already the engine gives black a pretty dominant advantage of minus 3.3 just because we have the bishop pair. And in addition to that, we also have a lot of good activity with our pieces. Meanwhile, White's knight on b1 is looking pretty sad, and the king has yet to move to safety. So I play knight to d7 with the intention of blocking off the rook from accessing d8, as well as moving over to e4, where it can apply pressure to a lot of these vulnerable squares in White's camp. So in this position, white chooses to play a5. I don't think this is a particularly useful move. Instead, I think white's best try would have been to castle and quickly try and drum up some activity on the d file. Um, but our opponent plays a5. And here I follow through with our plan, playing queen to c7. The idea being I want to keep our queen eyeing the king side because that's most likely where white's king is going to be headed. Simultaneously, I am freeing up the e5 square for our knight and also defending d8 so there's no rook d8 check, which could be nasty in some variations. So white castles, I continue our plan, and king to h3. So king to h3 is not a good move, and it's not a good move because of the move that I played next. Um, I just mentioned that I want to keep our queen eyeing squares around. Sorry, Ooh, I want our queen to eye squares around the white king. And if you notice, okay, I'll just give you guys a moment to pause the video if you want to see a nice, neat tactic here.
SWB audio
And the moment's
capture
over.
not
Okay, so
registered.
in this position, I play bishop takes h3. And the idea is if g takes h3, which was played, we have knight to f3. So I just want to take a moment to talk about what white's best tries would have been here. Taking the bishop, we will go through that shortly. I think rook to d5 probably is needed just to try and chase that knight away. But in all honesty, this position is already quite lost for white. So our opponent chooses to play g takes h3 and replay the knight in with the intention of moving our queen to h3 where it would deliver checkmate. So if white plays a zero move, queen to h2 is checkmate. So recognizing that, and also important to note, even if if the king moves up, this is still checkmate. Okay, so recognizing this, our opponent chooses to sacrifice his queen and move his rook over to g1. In this position, we are essentially up. Let's see, I have one, two, three, four, five, six pawns versus six pawns. Minor piece for a minor piece. And I have a rook and a queen versus two rooks. So essentially, I'm up a queen versus a rook, which is a winning advantage. I saw that our opponent wanted to play rook to g3 here. I just wanted to make our job as easy as possible without calculating too much, without overthinking too much rather. Bishop to e5 puts an end to that. Our opponent plays rook to c2, and I play queen to d7 with the intention of taking h3 of checkmate. Once again, if white plays a nothing move, this is simply mate. So our opponent blocks with his rook. However, this falls into what I played in the game, which is queen to d1. And after rook blocks, the queen would be able to take on c2. However, in this position, white chose to resign
SWB
instead.
audio capture
So we
not
are
registered.
one game in and we have one win. So let's jump on to the next one. In our next game, we played against a slightly higher rated opponent, Joey Su, a rising junior here in Sydney. And the rating 1652, I honestly believe, is bit is lower than his true rating because Joey has actually a history of I think he has had a win against an international master in the past. So he is definitely not an opponent to be scoffed at. So I play b3, the Nimzo Larsen. This is my usual opening for Blitz, Bullet, Rapid, and now I guess Classical as well. So knight to f6 is played, and here my main move is bishop takes f6. This is, of course, still theory, and in fact, we played theory up till mm, mm, this move. Here our opponent plays, oh, and also important to mention, I played d3 instead of maybe the more natural looking d4 because I want to keep control over the e4 square. Here our opponent plays bishop to h6, trying to stop us from playing knight to f4. However, I decided to do it anyway just because I think it is a good trade for us. And also the point of knight to f4 is to apply pressure on the d5 square, which really prevents black from playing d5 himself. These are lines that I will probably get into once I start my Nimzo Larsen opening series. So if you guys are interested in seeing that, do consider subscribing or turning on notifications, whatever the case may be. Um, and our opponent takes and plays bishop to e6. So nothing is. This is still a pretty equal position. Neither side has made any drastic mistakes, and some would say this is equal. This is even dead
SWB
equal.
audio capture not
So
registered.
queen to d7 is played, and I play rook to c2 here with the idea of moving my rook and doubling on this file, moving my queen out of the way, and then doubling that, uh, doubling that way would have taken one extra tempo, and I'm not sure our queen really knows where it wants to go just yet. So our opponent plays d5 here, and I move our rook over. I think taking would have been a slight mistake because of, say, knight takes, and once there's a series of trades in the center, this is not forced, obviously, but let's say this happens. White is stuck with this really awkward pawn on d3, and this can only serve to be a weakness for us. So our queen or one of our pieces has to babysit that isolated pawn at all times. So I choose not to take instead. I play rook to e2, rook c to e2, and our opponent takes the pawn. And an important note down here, even though there are also trades, we don't have that weak pawn on d3 anymore. In fact, we're applying some pressure on d5 still, which we'll see in the game did prove to be quite useful. Our opponent doubles up on the d file, and I move my queen away because I would rather avoid the queen trade. I think our queen has a lot of potential exploiting, sure, abusing the dark squares around on the long diagonal. So I decide I want to keep it for the moment. In hindsight, perhaps it would have been possible for me to immediately play. Oh, I guess not. Okay, so I move our queen over to b2. Sorry. And our opponent plays knight to d7 here, and here I saw a very pretty looking move. I did want to unleash our queen along this diagonal, but I didn't really particularly like the look of knight to a4, even though the engine gives that as the top choice. Just because I don't really see what the knight is doing there. It's dominated by white's pieces, which look after these squares already. And
SWV
eventually,
audio
I thought
capture
our knight would
not
probably have to move
registered.
back anyway. Instead, I saw that we had the opportunity to play knight to d5 instead. And the point of this move is after pawn takes, that bishop is effectively trapped. Our opponent does play knight to c5 with the idea of forking our queen and our rook, but I did see this and I thought we could simply take. After knight moves to d3, queen to f6, knight takes e2. And the oh, actually, one thing I do want to mention is if e takes f7, I saw that black could take with his king, and we would be able to get into this endgame with a check on g7, after which we can gobble up a few pawns on b7, h7, and probably these will fall too at some point. And I didn't like this as much just because the king is not forced to take. Instead, queen takes still is very strong, and eventually we are still going to lose an exchange. Let's say the queen moves back to say b1, knight takes, queen takes, and if you take stock of this position, black is up an exchange, and um, we do have an extra pawn that comes along with the exchange, but it's not particularly useful. It might be a different case if this pawn were on e5 instead, where it would be a pass pawn, but I didn't like how this looked as much. Instead, we played queen to f6 after knight takes e1. I saw we had this nice move, e7. And you might know this. The point of this move is to gang, number one, threaten to promote by taking or pushing. And number two, it also opens up this diagonal. I thought that black had to take the bishop here, after which we take with
SWV audio
check.
capture not
And
registered.
this exchange seemed as dead equal as could possibly be. And I thought that this was an okay variation to go down. Um, yeah. However, the reason why e7 is a blunder is because of this wonderful move, right, wonderful move, knight to f3. And the point of this move is after retake, black can give us a check on d1, and our king has to move up. After which, the a8 rook simply slides over to e8, whereupon it puts pressure on the e7 pawn. And this rook eventually is going to drop back to either d6 or d7, and this pawn is basically a goner. So it's thankful that our opponent didn't see this in the game itself. Otherwise, we would just be losing. The engine gives this minus 2.4, which is a winning advantage, or losing disadvantage, depending on whether you're glass half full, glass half empty. And Thankfully, our opponent actually falls into our trap. An important point as well is if rook to d7, this is simply mate because of the following. So our opponent plays rook to e8, and here we play bishop to d5, and the mate threat on f7 is virtually unstoppable. Uh, Black would have to sacrifice his pieces, and here we are up an exchange. Actually, the game's not even over. The variation's not even over because knight takes, bishop takes probably, and we're up a queen and a bishop versus a lone rook, which is obviously a winning advantage. So this concludes this
SWV
concludes
audio
round two, and
capture
so far
not
we are two
registered.
out of two. We move on to our next game where we are playing Heath Brown, rated 1923. So the games are starting to get pretty serious, and our opponents are getting pretty strong as well. Um, just just for reference, these are official FIDE ratings, and online ratings tend to be a bit inflated compared to FIDE. So 1923 over the board. I did speak with Heath Brown after the game. He mentioned that he is a solid 2300 to 2400 player online. So just for reference, this is obviously a very strong opponent. We did get a double white, and so I double white meaning I had white in round two and then again in round three. And I choose to exploit that fact by playing my favorite Nimzo Larsen. Our opponent plays d5, c5, and we're going to skim through some of this opening. Bishop to b5 is pinning the knight to the king. Um, and after knight to f6, I choose to quickly double his pawns before he's able to play bishop to b7 or queen to c7, where after which he'll be able to take back with one of those pieces instead, preserving his pawn structure. I play d3 here. My main idea in these lines is usually to play for e4 instead. If our opponent ever uh, responds with d4 himself, he opens up this juicy c4 square, which is a long-term weakness. So g6 is played, knight to f3, and these are pretty normal moves. An important point is in these positions, after black plays a5, our default move is always a4, bishop to a6, and our opponent moves his queen over to b6. I think he's preparing lines where c4 comes in some lines, in some variations, and we'll see that that actually came to fruition. So I play rook to b1, just if the point being if c4 here, I can take, and he doesn't have time to take back because I take his knight on f6, after which
SWV audio
we are going to be
capture
attacking the
not
queen.
registered.
The queen has to move here. I guess the entrance is the best move is to take the rook, after which we're simply up a queen for a rook in this position. So our opponent sees that obviously, and he chooses not to go for it. Instead, he develops his other rook to the center of the board, and so do we. Down here, queen to b4. The idea is he's still preparing c4 in some lines, after which he can take on a4. I saw this and I didn't think it was too convincing for black. Instead, I saw this as an opportunity to take advantage of the queen's position and play queen to c1, preparing this battery, um, preparing to move the bishop to a3, after which it will be defended by the queen on c1. Our opponent offers a trade of bishops, and in this position, I spent some time calculating if queen to b2 accomplished much. In the end, I didn't really see much of a an advantage after f6. Um, Figured e4, maybe even e5 in some lines, and I feel like black is perfectly fine here. Okay, so we take, and here's when I decide to push e4 instead. Um, our opponent plays e6, and I wanted to open up some lines where our queen come in to the king side. I see all these dark, weakened dark squares since we traded the dark square bishop since we traded dark square bishops with black. So I wanted to see whether I could make full advantage of that. This night, my pie in the sky dream was for it to maybe jump to h2 and g4, and maybe I could jump my queen in. Obviously, our opponent's not going to give us so many free moves, but that was sort of where my mind was at. Okay, so
SWB
our opponent
audio
plays c4
captured,
here,
not
which I
registered.
don't think is a particularly good move. I take on c4 and he takes on a4. And we have one more set of trades. I was pretty proud of this sequence. After checking with the engine later, I did make the right captures at the right moves. Um, and in this position, I played rook to a1. It's also pretty important to note there at no point was this queen trapped. If say I had taken, sorry, at no point was his queen in danger of being trapped. Um, because he can always jump out to b4 uh, and run away basically. So instead, what happened in the game was, yep, and our opponent did play queen to b4 eventually as well. And here I liked our position quite a bit because we have these connected pawns in contrast to black's isolated pawns. And not only that, but our light squared pawns kind of blunt his light squared bishop. And also, these pawns are pretty easy to defend with our knights, namely with knight to d4. And this knight is actually such a good piece because black doesn't have any pieces that can really contest it. Um, not right away, not right away at least, because the pawn is blocking the frontal view. The side is protected by this pawn. Uh, our pawn defends both adjacent squares, and if you really wanted to, he would have to waste a couple of tempo to attack our knight. After which we would obviously um, we would have plenty of time to address that threat. And also, knight to d4, in addition to defending the c2 square, also threatens maybe knight to c6. And so our opponent sees that and decides to stop it. And here our knights kind of jump into action. He offers a trade of
SWB
rooks,
audio
and our
captured,
rook
not
doesn't really have anywhere to
registered.
go. It's blocked in by our other rook. So I decide instead of letting him take on a1, we should take on a8. So our rook is still on this active b file defending the b3 square. And okay, I take it back. So I immediately move our rook to a1. The point being, black doesn't have time to push, not only because we're defending that square quite thoroughly, but also because the bishop is on pre. He moves his bishop back, and here I saw that there were potentially some lines where the knight could jump up to c5 and b3 could be played, after which our pawn structure is kind of under attack. It's not losing, obviously, but I didn't really want that to happen. So I played our knight back to b3, after which we are defending that c5 square. F4 was played, rook to a7. Getting a rook to the seventh file can is seldom a bad idea, so I brought it there. And here I actually made a pretty serious mistake. F4 gives up all of the advantage, basically. At this point, the engine gives plus 1.3, and this point, the engine only gives plus 0.3, which is virtually even when humans are playing. The point of this, the reason why this is a bad move is because the knight can move over to h5 and attack this pawn, where after which it's very difficult for us to defend. Um, Play might continue. Knight c5, bishop moves up, g4 takes, knight takes check, king to h2, knight moves back, and important point in this position, bishop to a8 would be a dead mistake because of rook to c8, after which this fork wins the bishop. So bishop to e8, and this line I wasn't too convinced by. The
SWB audio captured, not
not that I wasn't too
registered.
convinced. I didn't even see this because I missed f4 completely. I only noticed this line in the on the next move, and this would have been a very good equalizing try for black. Um, his pawns are far apart, but this is a complete passed pawn. And while I would argue, practically speaking, this is a bit easier for white to play compared to black. Um, both sides have to be careful, and most likely this would end up in a draw. So uh, knight to h5 was perhaps a missed opportunity by our opponent, but we are grateful for that. And here we decide to give a couple of checks, and I move behind the d5 pawn, which is difficult to defend at this point. I actually missed that black could simply play bishop to b7 again, but I saw that knight to a5 would be good for chasing that bishop away. He plays rook to e6, after which the point being, if knight takes, rook takes, and this is somewhat of an equal exchange, it's still better for white by the engine gives about a point, but I didn't really want to part with our uh, active knights in exchange for anything less than at least a pawn. So I play king f2 instead and decide in this position the d5 pawn is virtually untouchable. Let's swing our attention over to the b4 pawn instead. Our opponent plays d4, after which I am happy, which I'm super happy to see because he weakens the c4 square, which we immediately take advantage of. And c4 is a good launching pad to get to e5. So our opponent plays bishop to a4 here. I throw in a check, throw in another check. In this position, I saw that there were some lines. I spent a good amount of time calculating actually if king to h6
SWB audio captured,
was
not
good for white,
registered.
and in fact it is because of g4. The point being, if f takes g4, h takes g4, we're threatening this fork. And if black does nothing, perhaps knight to e8 or something, we would immediately have this checkmate on h7. Quite a pretty checkmate at that. So, but our opponent is not forced to play king to h6. He can obviously move back, which he does. Um, and I continue to take the b4 pawn. And here I wasn't too unhappy with this exchange just because we still have an extra pawn and our knights are quite active. Not to mention they're harmonious with each other. They can easily jump to squares where they defend each one another. Now our opponent realizes that knight h5 is a move. Um, and I decide to continue with our plan and coordinate our knights. In fact, down here, since we're up a pawn, I was okay with this trade, knight for bishop, and our opponent allows it too. In this position, just to take stock, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 pawns. Our opponent has 1, 2, 3. And not just that, but one of our pawns is an advanced, not an advanced pawn, but a pass pawn. So rook to c1, his idea is he wants to play rook to f1, which in fact I think did happen in the game, but oh, it didn't happen. Sorry, my bad. Yeah, and in this position, I I wanted to quickly push our pawn up. However, it would have run into rook to f1, so I decided to chase his knight away instead. Throw in a couple of checks. His knight moves up to h5, where it eyes the f4 pawn. I shuffle a bit and decide, okay, I want to move my knight over
SWB
to
audio
g4, and
captured,
this somewhat
not
sets a
registered.
trap for our opponent. If our opponent plays rook to f1, which was played, we can simply move the king aside, and I was hoping that our opponent would play rook to f4, which he did. The point being, we have this beautiful move, knight to f6, forking the king and the knight. It's not often you get to fork a knight with a knight, but this is one of those cases. The point of this is if knight takes, we don't immediately take the rook because then black takes on d7 and he simply up a pawn, up a whole piece in the endgame. And this is, I mean, the engine gives negative 35.9, but this is effectively just lost. Yeah. Instead, we have this beautiful intermediate move, or intermezzo, depending how fancy you want to be. Rook to d8. After which, if the king moves up, we just take the rook then. So our opponent is forced to play the knight back. Afterwards, we capture, rook blocks, king takes. And true, this is 2 pawns versus 2 pawns, but this is a winning endgame, and I did see this in the game. Play might have continued d4, d5, and in this position, our king easily infiltrates into black's camp. We can take these pawns while black's king has to babysit the d5 square instead. I'm just gonna quickly check I'm still recording, and I am fantastic. Okay, super cool. So let's get back to the game. Our opponent, recognizing that knight takes f6 is a mistake, um, also important to note, if the king just moves away, say to f8 or something, we take his knight, and he doesn't have time to recapture because we take on f4, and now we are up a rook. So recognizing this, our opponent plays rook to f6, pawn takes f6, knight takes f6,
SWV
and this is
audio
still, it's not
capture
the easiest
not
endgame
registered.
to win because two pawns and a knight, knights can be tricky in endgames, and we will soon see that there was a pretty nasty trap that I almost walked into actually. So play continued as follows. I just march our pawn up the board. And here after g4, um, I could have actually pushed d7, the point being after g3. Rook to g6 would fork the king and the pawn, and we would win the pawn back. However, I didn't really see the need to move into these complications. Instead, sorry, Mo- uh, yeah, instead moving the king back to f4 basically just paralyzes these pawns, and meanwhile, our rook and pawn have a good have an easy job of getting the pawn to the eighth rank. So they continued as follows, and here our opponent played h3, which was a pretty devastating trap. In fact, my hand was in the air, just to set the scene. My hand was in the air, and I was about to take that pawn when I realized that if we did, immediately you can see the evaluation bar jumps to 0 because of knight to g5, king moves, knight takes, and this pawn is falling soon as well, after which that would be a dead drawn endgame. Not even just a dead drawn endgame, that would just be drawn because of insufficient material. So I instead I played rook to e8, getting the rook off the forking square, king to g7, and we promote. And here after h2, our opponent resigns because we are just in time to defend the h1 square, and checkmate for king and rook is trivial. So this marked the end of day one of the tournament on the 25th of January. And if you're keeping track, we have
SWV
3
audio
points through
capture
three
not
games.
registered.
Um, and with three more rounds in the in on the next day. I think at this point there were only three people in the tournament who had 3 points. So I was very prepared to play against a very strong opponent in the next round. So the next day I found that we were playing against uh, Tomek Ray, who I'm sorry, this kind of spoils it, the score on the top left. Who Tomek Ray is a FIDE master. Uh, yeah, rated 2253, obviously such a monster rating. Uh, the equivalent to this online would likely be, say, 2800. So I definitely had my work cut out for me. So our opponent plays d4. I was prepared with all of my lines in the King's Indian, which did happen. However, here our opponent kind of surprised me. He played h3, which is a move, and in all honesty, it's a move that I should have prepped. I should have prepped against as well, but I've kind of skipped all h3 lines just because it's not super common on at the online or lower rated levels. If you take a look at the how common different moves are here, knight to f3, as well as bishop to e2, together those make up 60% of all games. F3, the same-ish, takes up 19% of games, and all other moves comprise the remaining however much percent I just mentioned. Yeah. So H3, and here I was actually kind of scared because the King's Indian is an opening where um, if you don't know exactly what you're doing, it's very easy to get steamrollered. And I saw that H3 was preparing G4 in a lot of lines, where white would prepare an attack against our king side, which is obviously where our king is going to
SWV
end
audio
up.
capture not
Um,
registered.
oh, I shouldn't say obviously, but in all likelihood, that's where our king is going to end up. And I wasn't really sure about the exact technicalities of that position. So I decided I'm just going to castle. That can't be the wrong move. Bishop to e3. And here I kind of borrowed some lines from the same-ish variation with the pawn on f3 instead of h3, because I saw the queen side is largely the same, or it's exactly the same rather. So I can play a6. He plays queen to d2 and c6. The point being, I want to play for b5, and after the king, Like the king is discouraged from castling queenside because we have an attack brewing already. Um, and if the king castles to the king side, then I'm pretty happy with that because it's less likely that he's going to be launching an attack on our king. I feel like with these stronger rated players, I would rather avoid like incredibly tactical lines. And as we'll soon see, I'm a bit of a hypocrite for saying that because I very shortly after this, I make uh, a bold decision to go into extremely tactical lines. So here I play e5. The idea being this might look like a free pawn, but after, say, the following, we have knight takes e4, after which knight takes and bishop takes. This is exactly the kind of opening position that I would love to play against a stronger player just because uh, mm, it's still there is a slight imbalance, but effectively this is leaning towards a drawish position, especially with queens off the board. Queens can be so tricky sometimes. I did hope that this might have happened, but I didn't expect it obviously because our opponent is a FIDE master, 2253 FIDE master at that. So he does take, but he doesn't take the second time. And here our opponent castles instead. I
SWB
played queen
audio
to a5
capture
here, which I
not
think is a pretty
registered.
useful move. It kind of makes him think that I makes him think twice about moving this knight potentially because not only am I going to be eyeing the queen, and I can take on maybe some more favorable terms. But this knight is also doing an important role at babysitting the a2 pawn. So after queen to d6, because I mentioned that a2 pawn, I saw that I had a very Fischer-esque move, knight takes e4, and in all honesty, I did calculate some lines where after queen takes a2, I might be able to attack the black king, attack the white king, and swing my bishop out to f5. In excuse me. In the end, all of those lines turned out to be phantoms as well, because like they just didn't work. But in fact, white has a much simpler way of avoiding any complications with queen to a3, which our opponent immediately played. This I completely missed, but here I didn't like the engine gives this as nearly plus 3 points for white, but I didn't I still didn't think that we were that much worse. 2 pawns for a piece. I thought that unleashing this bishop against the white king and launching a pawn storm might have been enough to get some complications that we might come out alive from, but that just wasn't meant to be. So I play a5, the intention of playing b4 and hopefully trying to open up the position a bit more. And I was happy to see knight takes c8 because he brings our rook over to this open file. Um, this would have been a bit of a pipe dream, but this would have been my best case scenario. But even still, the engine gives this as plus 2 points for white. So I'm, excuse me. So I'm still pretty lost here in this position.
SWB audio capture
But I have to
not
try for something.
registered.
So I play b4. Um, And down here, I saw that c5 paved the way for bishop to uh, c4 with check. So I played h7, and honestly, the rest of this game is not too worth getting into just because it finishes up pretty quick. But I just want to point out on here, our opponent has a very nice move, knight to g5. After which, if we take, how often do you really get a pawn checkmate? I guess it's not technically a pawn checkmate, but checkmate is coming very soon. Perhaps with the following. And yeah, so I recognize that we couldn't take the knight immediately. I move our king back. Only the virtually like and in fact the only other move. And after h5, I just wanted to make some space for my king, and I was hoping in some lines maybe he would blunder. Um, but unfortunately, that was not the case. He managed to force our king over to this f7 square, and I resigned in this position because knight to c7 would have been check, and he wins the rook. And I'm not gonna insult a FIDE master by pretending I can hold that position. So At this point, I have 3 points out of 4 games, which is still a very respectable score. And if you had asked me in the beginning of the tournament, would I have been happy with that? I would have been happy with 2 or 2.5 points. So 3 points was kind of already above my expectations. This was my first classical tournament. Well, I actually I should preface that statement. I played a lot when I was a child, when I was a bit more of a competitive youth. And I did play in a few classical tournaments back then, and I performed pretty well in a few of them in fact. But this was effectively my first classical tournament in, say, uh, upwards
SWV
of
audio
12, 13,
capture
14
not
years even,
registered.
probably. So 3 points out of 4 games, I was quite happy still. And losing to a FIDE master, I it I w- obviously I wanted to get some points on the board against him, but I feel like that was also more of a bonus in my eyes. Anyway, in the next round, I play against Munkbat Anand. I hope I'm pronouncing that correct. And this player is also rated 1923, so still a very strong player as well. And I have the white pieces. I play b3, and our opponent chooses to go for this line. Very similar to what we had in round 3 against Heath Brown. Bishop to g4 was played instead. And I choose just to be principal and castle. Here I take take the knight on c6 because I want to double his pawns, and I go for a very similar plan with d3, expecting e4 at some point. Our opponent plays bishop to d6, knight b to d2, castles, h3, just kicking the bishop away, asking him what's up. He moves it back, and I play e4. And important to note, actually, at this point, just pulling up the score sheet. At this point, neither of us has really used any time. I mentioned that there is a 30-second increment per move, and we start off with an hour each. And right in this position, we both still have uh, more than an hour, in fact. And our opponent very quickly plays queen to c7. I'll just give you a second to pause the video or see what to see if you want to guess the next move that I played. It shouldn't be too difficult. I played e5, which simply forks the bishop and the knight. I think our opponent's mistake was he was playing a bit too quickly, and he assumed that b3 was not a venomous threat. So he could afford to play in such fashion. However,
SWV
he falls
audio
into this
capture
classic
not
center fork
registered.
trick, after which he loses a piece for a pawn. And here I I was pretty I was obviously very happy with the position, and I knew that this was a one position. I just needed to actually win it, which sometimes is more is easier said than done. Especially against such a strong opponent, I could not afford to just rest on my laurels and let the position play out itself. Especially because his pieces are all either aimed or tangentially aimed or potentially aimed at my king, and he has all these pawns that he can use at his disposal that he can use for an attack. So I decided I want to go after his bishop. At least I can trade off some of his pieces. A good general rule in chess, when you're up material, you want to trade pieces because the analogy I always give is an army of 10,000 people versus 9,999 is less of an advantage than an army of one versus zero. So when you're up material, reducing that like increasing the relative difference in your armies is a good option. Uh, And it also just removes like pieces that your opponent can make threats and potentially recover the game with. So knight to h4 was played, and here I took his bishop. He takes back with the pawn. I think the computer recommends queen takes, but pawn takes. I guess his idea is to open up the h file. Um, and I played this very odd looking knight to h1. The idea being, I saw that f4 was going to be played in some position, and I didn't want f4 and f3 to come with tempo. So I wanted to preempt that by playing knight to h1 myself. So I think I'm having I'm falling a bit sick, or my throat's a bit dry at least. I've been having a little bit of a cough
SWV audio
recently.
capture not registered.
So f4, and I play f3 down here. The point being, I want to be able to jump our knight into f2 and g4, after which it would be locking the position down. Our opponent moves his rook up. and we do exactly what we said we were going to do. Kind of an important note, the pawn capturing on g4 still defends h5, so the rook can't just swing over because, well, takes. So after we take back, he drops his rook back, and here I saw we had this nice move d4. The point being, if pawn takes, we simply take his rook, that pawn is pinned, and if the other pawn takes, we take back our bishop. And here still, if the pawn takes, we take his rook. And remember, we were up a bishop before. Trading a bishop for a rook would mean that we were up a rook in this position. So our opponent obviously doesn't do this, and he plays c5 instead. I had an option here with which side of the board I wanted to move the bishop to, and I decided against bishop to f2, even though the engine gives that as the best choice, because I was maybe concerned about black getting some counterplay with moving his rook over to these to the h file, after which my king kind of loses an escape square, and it's not super obvious how this bishop wants to go in. I think that would have been a bit too awkward in any case. So bishop to b2 instead. And an advantage of this as well is we keep an eye on the e5 square, the e5 pawn rather. He moves his king up, I move my queen up, and c4. C4 was a good find by our opponent. The point being, if pawn takes, the queen has his double attack against the king and our bishop. I calculated some lines down here about moving the bishop in, and I wasn't too convinced by this.
SWV
Yeah,
audio capture,
I wasn't very
not
convinced by this. The
registered.
engine still gives white an advantage, but I think it's much less clear than it needed to be. So I obviously don't take, I just drop my queen back. And our opponent plays g5 with the intention of moving his rooks over to the open h file and annoying our king. Also, excuse me. Also important to note, if queen is c5 here, my intention was to move the queen to f2 and just block off that diagonal. But I recognize that maybe I can just nip it in the bud and prevent the queen from coming to either c5 or b6 at all. So I move my queen to a5 to that effect. And here I decided I just wanted to trade queens. Um, but in fact, I had a nice move, rook takes e6, e5 here, because after queen takes, we can simply double against the rook. And there's so much pressure, eventually something is going to give. I guess our opponent can play queen to b6. Um, but this is so unpleasant for black, and conversely pleasant for white. I just missed this move, to be honest. I also intend on trading our queens that allowed this to happen, which in fact allows our opponent to kind of win back the bishop. Down here, I played bishop to a7. However, bishop to a3, I didn't like this as much because rook takes and this pawn starts getting very nasty, and I think black has too much counterplay or more than he needs to. Instead, I decide I'm going to give the bishop back. I take on a7, and rook to a6 is played, after which our bishop has no squares. All of these squares are defended by black's rooks. And here I had a choice.
SWV audio capture, not
Yeah,
registered.
here I had a choice. I decided to play c5. I could have gone for the same position with rook takes, and then playing c5, but I wanted to see if our opponent might blunder. I thought that was more independent value of c5, because if he doesn't immediately take the bishop, we can always jump back to b6, after which it'll be defended. Minor point, and obviously I don't think our opponent would have fallen for it, but I think this is just a slightly not more accurate move order, but the move order that gave us more opportunities. And in this position, I play a4, and I calculated that uh, if rook takes, this pawn is faster than this pawn can never be. If rook takes c2, for instance, uh, yeah, we can just simply push our pawn. The rook comes back, and here we can jump our king in. Oh, actually, the engine gives this as equal. I guess maybe my evaluation was slightly wrong. There is a better move order here. king to f2 immediately, I guess. Oh, okay, that's interesting. Guess point is rook e8, a7. Rook has to go back. And the point is moving g3 instead. Okay. Okay, but I think I probably would have found that in the game if we had reached such a position. But my intuition that this was a winning position is correct. Uh, so anyway, let's get back to the main game. Our opponent down here, his idea is he wants to move down to b2 and bully the c2 pawn. I didn't want to allow that, but in playing rook to a2, I kind of missed. King to f6 forces our rook over to d5, or it doesn't. But in order to keep the c5 pawn, we have to move our rook over.
SWB
And
audio
in this position,
capture,
I actually got a
not
bit nervous
registered.
because I saw that rook to e8 would have basically saved the game for black. The point being, he can coordinate his rooks on either the e file or the first rank. Um, and our king doesn't have too much of an escape. We probably have to sacrifice a pawn and um, sacrifice a pawn to not lose the game immediately. And the position is still very sharp, but it would probably end up with a draw with best play. Thankfully, our opponent kind of misses that. He plays rook d1 instead. And here I give up pawn in exchange for the d4 pawn, and I give up another pawn in exchange for coordination between our rooks and our two pass pawns. And here our opponent, important point, if I take here, if this is still winning, but I think this gives too much activity for black, and I kind of have to think a little bit more. Um, yeah, this is still winning though, but I didn't want to allow any sort of counterplay. So I play rook b7, the idea being I want to play rook 7 to b3, and play continued as follows. Uh, Here, actually, my play wasn't completely accurate because I allowed him to take on f3. Um, yeah, the engine actually gives rook to c2 as stronger here. What's the idea behind this? Okay, king to a6. Okay, that makes sense. King to a6, the idea being this rook defends this pawn and it's gonna keep pushing. Meanwhile, our king can jump into b7 at some point too. So I played rook to c4 instead. I guess this preserves a lot of the same options as well. But
SWB audio capture,
yeah,
not
what is
registered.
the issue here? Why isn't king 8? I see. Okay, the rook on c2 would have defended the f2 square. That's the key difference. Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, but I made a mistake and let him take on f3, and I play rook to e4. This is still, I would argue, a winning position, but our opponent here makes the worst move in the position. He plays king to d8, and I'll just let you pause for a minute to look for White's winning continuation, and I'll give you a hint. It involves a mate in 6 moves. Um, one of which is not hard to find, but it's hard to find 6 moves in advance. So I play rook to d6, king to c7, rook to e7 check, king goes to b8. All these are force moves. Rook to b6 check, king to a7. And I think the move that's hard to find, the finishing blow, is king to a6, a quiet move. And the point of king to a6 is we're preparing rook to a7 checkmate. And meanwhile, the king can't be dislodged from here, and black's king can't be evacuated from a7, a8 either. Yep. And in this position, our opponent resigns. So right now we are at 4 points out of 5 games, and I'm paired against Ertan John Hussein, who is also actually an underrated player who's having a really good tournament. So we played a French, and our opponent takes and exchange French. I do have prep against this, and we actually follow my prep for quite a few moves. Our opponent, Ertan White, he actually he goes into the tank here, and he thinks for quite a long time. Let me just pull up the score sheet. In this position, our opponent uses
SWB audio capture
18
not
minutes. He
registered.
uses 18 minutes. And I asked him after the game, he said that he was simply unfamiliar with this line, which I was a bit surprised by, but uh, yeah, but that's fine. Our opponent plays knight to c3, and each of these moves, our opponent is burning quite a bit of time off the clock. I think I was pretty happy to see it because I'm still very much deep in my prep, or not even deep in my prep. This is still pretty shallow in my preparation, and I have many moves that I can play on autopilot. I virtually use zero zero time on my clock up till move 11. Yep, all this is theory, or if not theory, this is the line recommended in the chessable course that I follow. The chessable course is Lifetime Repertoire French Defense by Anish Giri, I believe. Uh, And here our opponent, these are all pretty natural looking moves. I'm just developing our pieces to the best squares. Important to note, I'm also putting lane control over the d5 square. Whenever you have an IQP as the side defending the IQP. So if you have the IQP, you want to be able to push the pawn, and conversely, if you're facing the IQP, you want to lay control over the pawn right in front of it, the square right in front of it. Bishop to b1. The idea here is pretty simple. Our opponent wants to play queen to c2, which does happen in the game. I decided in this position our bishop is not doing too much on b4, so I might as well drop it back to e7. And our opponent does play queen to c2, after which we play g6. The idea being I want to defend the f5 square whilst preventing his queen from getting to h7, so I can move our bishop in and skewer his queen and bishop, and I'm happy with the trade here. I drop our bishop back because g6 makes more sense when I'm fianchettoed, not to
SWB
mention
audio
the
captured
queen is attacking
not
h6, and
registered.
I didn't like the look of king to h7 as much. And our opponent goes for a try f5. Here I went to the tank a little bit as well. I think I spent, let's see, this is move 19. I spent about 10 minutes on this move, actually. Or I spent 10 minutes on the move right before this because I saw f5 was coming. I spent 10 minutes when f4 was played, it looks like. Yeah. And at this point, our opponent actually only has 2 minutes on the clock, so he has to make virtually all his moves instantaneously. I was scared down here actually because I thought that maybe bishop takes g5, h takes g5, queen takes g5 might be scary with some knight moving in ideas or rook lift ideas. But I saw that in this position I could simply play knight to h7, the queen has to move aside. And we could even play queen g5, queen to f6 and defend quite solidly. So our opponent, I think he recognized this and played bishop to g3, and virtually all his moves here and out are instantaneous because he is so low on the clock. 2 minutes with 30-second increment is not that much time for a classical game, especially when there's still so much chess left to be played, which is the case in this position. So I move our knight in, just wanted to trade some pieces. And open up the E and D files for our rooks. He plays f6, which actually I thought there might have been something here, and I guess so did our opponent. Um, but I can simply play queen to g6, bishop takes, queen takes, and after bishop to e5, I lay a trap for our opponent. I play rook a to d8. Um, you can pause the video if you want to see what the trap is, or you can pause the video here to see how we exploit the trap. The move I played here is queen takes e5, and in this
SWB
position,
audio
our opponent
captured not
resigns,
registered.
which puts us at a clean 5 points out of 6, finishing our first tournament with a pretty spectacular performance. First place was an international master who got 5.5 points, and in second place, four of us tied for with 5 out of 6. So the people who tied were a FIDE master, two candidate masters, and me. So I was very happy with that result. Um, and I hope you guys enjoyed this video. There will surely be more to come. I think I'm going to be starting to play a little bit more classical chess and over the board chess as well. And at the same time, I want to build this into more of a variety chess channel where I'm not just playing bullet, I'm not just playing blindfold, but I'm encompassing different kinds of chess content. So once again, hope you guys enjoyed. If you have any comments or questions, please leave them downstairs, down in the comments. And yeah, hope you guys have a good week ahead, and wishing you many, many beautiful checkmates. See ya.